Good morning. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and you are watching our Need to Know election series. Today we have Mileah Kromer from the Goucher Poll helping us make sense of polls. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Mileah, and she is going to help us understand what's going on with polls.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me this morning. It's a real pleasure to get a chance to talk to you about my favorite thing, public opinion polling. And so I have like a little Google slide I was going to show when I'm talking. Rebecca said she's going to man the chat thing. So if you have any questions, like just pop it in the chat box. I'm going to talk for maybe just about like 10 minutes or so. And then I'm happy to take any questions. Or if you ding Rebecca, if it's a question you like answered while I'm talking, I can stop and talk to you about it then. But yeah, that's how we can do it. And I'll leave a lot of time at the end for questions. And the good news is tomorrow at 12:01 a.m. our new Goucher poll drops. So this is a really timely. I'll talk about a little bit about disclosure today. And our new Goucher poll comes out at 12:01 a.m. on Thursday. So that's a couple hours from now. It's pretty exciting. So I'm going to share my screen with you and bring up my presentation. I don't think you can see me anymore. Now you can just see the presentation. Right, Rebecca?
No, actually, you're along the side, so don't.
I'm on the side. Okay.
Yeah, don't make any rude gestures, anybody.
I won't be weird. Okay, great. Okay, so just today I'm going to talk just about what good journalists like you should know about good and bad polls. And there we go. And just thanks so much for having me. And you can find me if you don't already. Follow me on Twitter at Mileah Kromer. I tweet about a lot of poll stuff and about Maryland politics in general. So I have this presentation has 3 quick parts. How you identify high quality scientific surveys from low quality junk, what you should expect from people like me, and just a note about Pushpull to tell your friends. This is my my pet peeve that I've been trying to tell everybody about what an actual Pushpull is versus how we use the term Pushpull. So surveys are everywhere, but not every survey deserves your time and attention. And I think that's a really important thing to note. You might have remembered this. I don't know if anybody remembers seeing this last year. About half of Americans admit to wearing underwear for 2 days in a row. Survey revealed. It got picked up by Newsweek, and then it also got picked up by all the sort of local statewide media, and it got sort of all over the country. It's a problem. This was a junk survey that was not a scientific survey. It was effectively Tommy John, the underwear company, put a survey on their website or surveyed just folks that had bought Tommy John underwear. They filled out this survey. Tommy John then created this really nice sort of sleek release. They sent it out to the world and it got national coverage. It drives people like me absolutely bananas when this stuff happens. Because every unscientific survey that makes the news undermines real research, and it really paints a distorted opinion of what public opinion looks like, but also sort of the expectations of quality research, like what you should expect as a consumer of research. It also undermines the credibility of journalists like you who, frankly, who then take that survey and then put it out into the world. So I remember looking, just like cringing as all these journalists were picking up this survey. It's like, no, why aren't you being more discerning? And it happens now more than ever because there is an expectation of data-driven analysis and data-driven decision-making. And also the cost of survey research has increased, and it's easy to do these do-it-yourself survey tools. Almost every website has an ability to quickly put up a poll, survey their members. And with a little bit of glitz and glamour, you can turn just random numbers into like nice looking infographics. And sometimes that's enough to fool people into thinking this is real numbers or real research. And there's a lack of really poll literacy is the word I always use to describe it. So there's a lack of understanding of what goes into a scientific public opinion poll. And one of the reasons, the biggest reason, is that folks have realized that junk surveys can get you earned attention, get earned media, and that for any organization is like gold. So it's really incumbent upon journalists to make sure that you aren't being part of the problem. So what to look for, and these are the big things for you to look for. So the sponsor of the survey matters. Before you even think about writing about a survey or giving a survey a little bit of air, you got to figure out, you got to determine who the sponsor is. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier than other times because they try to bury the sponsor in the bottom part of the release, or they create sort of a scientific sounding organization name that actually becomes like the sponsor. But really with a little bit of digging, you can sort of figure out who it is. You have to ask yourself, why would somebody pay for an underwear poll? So that's I think a fundamental thing to ask yourself. So why would somebody pay for this poll? What would be the purpose of informing the public about underwear habits? And I use that as like this sort of an example, but you can think about that with any sort of singular issue. You should also, if the big thing on the disclosure, they need to tell you the questions as worded, and the order the questions appeared. Those types of things need to be disclosed to you. If you're just receiving from an organization their interpretation of what their narrative without actually showing you the results by the questions as worded, the order of the questions, all the response options, that's a problem. They need to show you the data. The margin of error and the field dates are also important. If they can't tell you when the survey was fielded, and if they can't tell you something about at least like the margin of error of the survey, that's a big red flag for you. And then the how and where is important as well. So how did the researchers collect their data? Was it a traditional telephone poll? Was it a link they put on their website? And where did their respondents come from? The problem with social media, I think, is you'll see folks, and not just especially organizations like governmental organizations are guilty of doing this, and I wish that they would stop. They have a bad habit of looking at data, like any data is better than no data. And so they will take a survey. They know it's expensive to conduct a scientific poll, and they'll toss it on a website and say, oh, or put it on their social media feed. Oh, Baltimore City residents who are interested in transportation, take our transportation survey. And then, people take it. There's really no barriers to entry. You can take it as many times as you want. And then they download the data, they create a nice executive report, they do some nice chart, graphics, and they send it out into the world. And sometimes policymakers are even influenced by these decisions. And what journalists can make sure they do is that they're not amplifying those voices by giving coverage to polls that aren't scientific. Check out APOR. If you're not familiar with the work APOR does, it's the American Association for Public Opinion Research. It's like our American Medical Association. So check it out, like always see it, check out the resources that they have for journalists. These are the questions that APOR says you should be asking yourself when you receive a press release from any organization. So I don't need to read them to you. You can have this. I'm going to give this presentation to Rebecca to send on to you just to have. But these are all the questions. These are from APOR's website. These are everything you need to know. If they can't answer those questions, or if these questions are not clear by their release, you need to follow up with the pollster if you're considering actually publishing this, or you need to ask yourself why they didn't disclose and all this information. These are all important elements of disclosure. But because you're busy, you should look at three things really quickly. The sampling, the questions, and the demographics. So they should be able to tell you right up front how they conducted the survey. Was it a phone survey or was it an online survey? We'll talk about that in a second. If they give you the questions, great. That's a great sign. And but demographics are important too. If you get a survey from somebody and they don't give you demographics, something is wrong. You should immediately start to question whether this is a scientific survey. Good scientific surveys come with a full disclosure in terms of demographics. That's something that we do immediately right up front with the Goucher poll. It's like it's right, that's on the page that comes right after our narrative. is a bunch of information about what Maryland demographics should look like, what our weighted sample estimate looks like, what registered voters look like in Maryland, and what our likely voters in Maryland look like, very clearly spelled out for you, so there's no question. Every reputable pollster should be getting in the habit of doing this. But just to be sure, and I think this is something that journalists run into, this idea of sponsored polls aren't inherently bad polls. So just because an organization like a business or a nonprofit or an interest group sponsors a poll, so just because the poll was done by Friends of the Earth or something, like, you know, name your environmental organization here, it doesn't make it a bad poll. It doesn't even make it a biased poll necessarily. It just means that you have to be more careful. So a lot of these organizations actually spend the money and produce sort of high quality polls. That they're paying a pollster to do really great research. You just have to look past the narrative they give you, because that's where the spin comes in, and just look right at the data. And always ask them about the questions they didn't release. So this is where the dodgy part comes in, I think, with organizations, is that they will often put on their poll different sort of questions that maybe perhaps can skew the remaining questions. So question order matters, questions they ask matter, because you should be taking a questionnaire as a whole, not just individual parts. But those things are really of value, and I don't think that you should shy away from perhaps reporting on a poll, as long as you're, you know, willing to do the disclosure part up front. Some of this stuff I think gives us really great information. I think environmental issues is a great example. Gives you a really nice picture about what this particular issue looks like by following up with the question of, like, why would this person sponsor this poll, is because they obviously care about environmental issues. But if they're willing to disclose to you the full methodological statement, all the questions as worded in order they were given, you should feel comfortable, if that's a reputable pollster, at least reporting on their results, with important caveats, of course. But I always think that even candidate-sponsored polls have value to journalists, especially if they're done by a reputable pollster. You are not going to find a reputable pollster willing to put their name on a survey that's going to be wildly inaccurate. Like, you're not going to have a horse race poll put out by a reputable pollster that shows a result that's not even in the ballpark of correct, like a fudged result. And I always say, best for me, like a great question, if I was a journalist, I would ask, what does it mean that you haven't seen any leaked surveys about the race? So, like, what does it mean if you have a candidate who is claiming that they're gaining ground, a candidate who's claiming that their sort of long shot campaign isn't really a long shot after all? That person should be producing to you some sort of leaked poll to the media to demonstrate that all the kind of these visible parts of the campaign are actually reflective of a real shift in public opinion. And online polls aren't inherently bad polls either. So you hear this a lot from people, oh, that's just an online poll. You shouldn't dismiss online polls out of hand. So survey methodologists and statisticians are really working hard to develop these, like, large probability-based or representative online panels. There is a difference between the work that folks like YouGov does, or Morning Consult, or Pew, who are building these really big sort of online panels, or a company like large companies like Donata. They're building sort of probability-based panels that are huge. Like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of people that actually look like Maryland, or look like Delaware, or look like the United States as a whole. Those things are fundamentally different than tossing your survey on your website and asking people to sort of fill it out. So you should check out the work. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it, the work that YouGov is doing with Huffington Post, or HuffPost now. It's really great stuff. There's a lot of benefits to online polling. Because you don't have to worry about reading the question over the phone. You can add in a little bit more complexity to polls. This is especially important for policy-based polls. So it's easy to administer the horse race over the phone, but I can tell you, as somebody who really specializes in doing policy-based polls, there are days that I really wish that the respondent had the question in front of them. They could actually read and think about the question, rather than just hearing it once or twice repeated on the phone. And just that cognitive ability, I think, changes the respondent's ability to really sort of think and digest that poll. But my buyer beware to you, just be careful. So there are a lot of organizations now that the quality of online polling varies greatly. Building an online panel is expensive and hard. And I want you to know that, because if you see organizations sort of like popping up with their own online poll, their own online sample or own online panel, you should really question that organization's ability to build and maintain that. So the issue with online polling, especially with panel construction, isn't just building the panel, it's maintaining the panel. So I can get a bunch of people to opt into my panel, and I can even make it look like Maryland. But the question is, 2 months later, have I been able to maintain those individuals? And have I been able to maintain the integrity of the panel in terms of its representative nature? And that's an expensive endeavor, because there is an expectation for a lot of panel respondents who are part of these large panels to get incentives every time they take a survey. So that's an additional cost every time people take the survey. And so just be wary, and obviously be wary of these organizations. If they can't tell you, or they won't tell you how they recruit or maintain their respondents, that's a red flag for you to sort of think about. Here's a great example. I think I just found this on USA Today of an example of an online survey that's done well through a reputable organization. It's a sponsored poll, but it provides, I think, something that's newsworthy. So like it's about Generation Z. Now, Gen Z would be really hard to identify on a telephone survey because Gen Zers are hard to get. Let me take it from me. They are hard to get on the phone. And so the Harris poll utilizes a large and probability-based sample. And what they, and they reach out to these individuals, 13 to 23-year-olds, and they asked them, and Adobe was obviously a package that people can use for Photoshop and all those different things. They were interested in sponsoring a poll. It gave them good press, but it also gave us a really kind of interesting insight in what Generation Z are thinking. This is just an example of like quality survey research. It's sponsored, it's online, that you should feel free or feel happy, should have no issue reporting on. And then of course, USA Today does the right thing and make sure they disclose up front how to, they disclose like really right immediately up front about that Adobe sponsored it. And so what you should expect, so you've received the poll in your inbox, and you'll receive one of those from me tomorrow at 12:01 a.m. And I expect, and you should look at me and you should treat me like this when you get something from me. There is two different standards we typically see. There's public polls, and those are folks like myself who do a public facing role. The goal of our organization is for polls for public consumption. And then there's the private sponsored polls. If somebody is claiming to be a public poll, you should expect nothing less from them than full disclosure. So if you try to use so public poll means full disclosure. That's a full methodology statement. That's a full demographic statement. That's questions as worded in the order in which they were received. And that is following every rule and regulation of the Transparency Initiative. And matter of fact, I would look to see if they're a member of APOR's Transparency Initiative, which we are. And you can always ask them for additional analysis. So if you see, you're like, oh, I want to see those results by X, Y, and Z, some crosstabs, these folks should be willing to do that for you. I know I am. You can always contact me. I'm happy to do it. Private or sponsored polls are a slightly different animal. They should have the same standards for disclosure in terms of their methodology, but you should expect them to want to withhold some questions. And that's often because they embed message testing within their sponsored polls. You should always check to see who does the polling work. Is it a reputable firm? Is it a firm you've heard of before? But it's the organization and not the pollster who will end up representing the work. And here's, I think, a good example of what happens. Again, I hate to pick on Newsweek. It's not that I don't like Newsweek, but this is an example of what happens and how quickly this stuff gets out of hand. So a dating site called Hornet released a survey, and they found this they found that like 45% of queer men are backing Trump. that went, honestly, it's newsworthy, I guess, because it was a stunning result. It also goes contrary to other what reputable pollsters like PRRI, who does this, who really focuses on religion and politics, and sexuality and politics. And this got picked up by Tucker Carlson tonight. It has 4.331 million viewers, and the website was, I think,
45% of gay
Well,
men said they would be voting for Trump. That was
Yeah,
one of the polls.
yeah. I mean, it's just not. I mean, it's not. Here's I guess the lesson here is, and once an organization lets their poll out into the world, they lose control of it. I make this joke a lot. That once I let the Goucher poll is my baby. Once I push it out into the world, I don't get to raise it. It's the media who gets to talk about the poll. And this is an example of an organization like Hornet. They are, I think, sort of mortified that their opt-in survey of their users ended up getting sort of mainstream media attention. But once you put it out in the world, there's no takebacks. So organizations need to be careful. And also, it's embarrassing, I think, for organizations, mainstream media organizations, reputable media organizations, to have to redact a headline or bring back an article if you're not careful, with what you're putting out there. So the Washington Blade followed up and was basically like, it's sloppy journalism. And so you don't want to be sloppy journalism. So my suggestion to you is just really, once you've given a bad survey air, it doesn't need you to live. So once you've given it air, you become part of the problem. So just be really, really careful with what you decide to write about. And it's just going back and going through the disclosure issues. And if it seems like this finding, like on its surface, it seems wrong, right? Like it seems like that doesn't seem quite right. Go back and look at sort of reputable organizations like Pew and PRI have already looked at this issue, and they found nothing of the sort. And I guess to close, and then I'll take questions. I hear this all the time. It's not so much journalists do it, but I have seen some journalists use the term push poll incorrectly. And I just want to correct the record because I want people to use it the right way. A push poll is a form of negative campaigning disguised as a poll. Push polls are really just telemarketing. They're not aimed to persuade, and they're aimed to persuade. They're not aimed to measure. So that it's a very specific thing. So it's like few questions. It's a poll you get. It has very few questions, all negative. You don't know who the sponsor is. The sample is extremely large, and there's no demographics asked. Like that type of poll. That's a push poll. It is not a poll that you don't like, or a poll with sort of even like message testing polls. So a message testing poll will use a traditional sampling methodology, and then they will try to figure out, what messages move respondents. The goal there is to actually figure out what moves public opinion, not just to push out a message. And so people often use the term push poll to describe a poll with perhaps leading or biased language. That's not necessarily what a push poll is. A push poll has that leading and biased language, but it also is just used to push out that leading or biased language. It's not really used to collect data on the back end. So you could get a poll from an organization. It's like, those questions that's worded aren't, you can see what they're trying to push the respondents to, but it's not a push poll per se. It's just a poll with a questionable question wording. And keep in mind, in terms of like an easy thing to look for, legitimate surveys have anywhere between 400, especially telephone surveys, between 400 and 1,500 interviews. If you get a telephone survey that's not like a national panel design with like 30,000 respondents on a telephone survey, like something's the matter, something's wrong. So that's a red flag, because telephones, it's expensive to do telephone surveys, and nobody's doing a 30,000 respondent telephone survey. And that's it. That's all I got for you this morning. And I can just and I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I hope that was helpful for you. And Becca, is there something you?
We're all coming back onto
Oh, good.
mute and onto different things. Could you talk a little bit about some of the national polls that we're seeing? And I know that the Goucher Poll's focus is very Maryland based, which is critical because there's not a lot of polling that happens statewide, and I think that's so important. But with the national election looming, you're getting all these really wildly disparate polling results. And of course, in the last election cycle, there was so much polling saying that Clinton was up by so much, and then although she won the popular vote, obviously didn't win the Electoral College. So what should journalists really be looking out for when you have like wildly disparate results? And does that kind of wildly disparate stuff invalidate the whole schmear sometimes?
So I'm going to go, and I will say what I've been saying since 2016. So there has been a problem with people conflating election predictions, like the folks at 538 and I think HuffPost had one at that time. Like, so these people who are doing the electoral modeling versus political pollsters. So these electoral models, take into consideration a bunch of a lot of input. So it's not just polling, but other sort of economic factors. And then they create this sort of probability of victory. And what happened in 2016 is that some of the really reputable election forecasters basically said that, Clinton has this really high percentage chance of winning, in the 80s and 90%, depending on who you looked at. If you took a closer look at those polls that were coming out of the swing states, yes, there were some misses and there were some things that pollsters did to correct it. But what you really saw, if you took a closer look at the trends of the individual states and ignored the big picture forecaster, is that Trump steadily narrowed his lead, steadily cut into Clinton's lead in those key swing states as we approach closer and closer to election day. And so that signal got lost, I think, in the noise or that overall story of is these reputable election forecasters say that Clinton has an 85% chance of winning, and people then started ignoring, looking at what the individual polls were saying. I'm for poll aggregation, but I'm really for folks looking at the pollsters who have done the work, who have a reputation of quality public opinion research. So we've been in Maryland now for 8 years, and I have put out transparent results and focused here on Maryland. There is other reputable pollsters in different states that are doing the same sort of work. They're not fly-by-night kind of organizations. And you should really, a pollster's reputation matters, I think. And so focusing in on those sort of those quality statewide polls to really help understand the election is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously Marist does great work, Quinnipiac does great work. And then there's obviously the larger Washington Post, their pollsters are second to none. The Washington Post does fantastic work on their polling. These sort of high quality live caller, dual frame samples, heavy cell, that I think right now gives you the clearest indication of where the election is at in these sort of key swing states. Online pollsters, like the folks at Morning Consult, the folks at HuffPost and who do YouGov, HuffPost, they're getting increasingly better. So they're building these massive online panels that are really representative, and they're getting, I think, they're doing increasingly a good job. But for me right now, there's no substitute for sort of high quality live interviewer, dual frame, heavy cell polls. And the problem is they're just really expensive. Mm-hmm. So we do the Goucher poll twice a year. We're trying to scrape together funding and trying to find grant sources so we can do it 4 times a year.
Right.
Is not easy. But that's what I would say. I would look at those high quality polls, those high quality state polls.
Okay.
We get in our I get it in my email just about every day from a company called Lattice Publishing. It's a PR firm that does a lot of things. But they will send out, and I'll get 2 emails back to back. One is specifically about Baltimore, and one is specifically about Maryland. And it said the other day, I'm ready to let you know about a new report about metropolitan areas And in the Baltimore, Columbia, Towson metro area, 8% of all workers are members of the accommodation and food services industry, which relies heavily on tourism. So they are sending all these different polls. And this was a poll that was, it says it was sponsored by Smart Dollar and goes there. And they give the link to the whole study and the press release. But I always take these things with a grain of salt. Like you're saying, who's sponsoring it? Why are they doing it? And we really have used this more in, okay, does this represent a trend that we need to worry about? I work for a Catholic publication. So the question is, you know, what does this poll have to do with, if it's about, you know, 20% of people in the Baltimore area use paycheck services, and that compares to a national average of 10%. You know, then that gives us a story that we might want to work on. Is there an income equity? So we're using these more for story ideas rather than writing about the poll. Is that still a good idea?
Yes, I think that's fine. As a matter of fact, I also don't think polls should, like, I think that there are some high quality, let me frame it this way. I think that there's some high quality state polls where their releases could get to stand on their own. But I also think that survey research in general is a great context to support a larger story about like income inequality. That's just one data point in the larger story about the income inequality. So use polls as supporting data and sometimes not necessarily the lead of the story. And I honestly, some of the best work that's done on the Goucher poll that I absolutely love is like when our poll results are used in like a larger story about something. Like I think it's great, like that, you know, we talk about sports betting, for example, that people will bring in our poll results as just one chunk of the story, but not the entire story. Because while I think public attitudes matter greatly for the representative democracy, I think it's only one small part of the policy making process. And so particularly if you're talking about policy, use polls as a supplement, use it as a data point, but it doesn't have to drive the whole entire story. And I think you're right, like you should investigate, like that's really great that you're like carefully looking at like whether or not this is a valid source of information about that unique subset of Marylanders.
Thank you.
What other questions do people have? I don't want to be too asky, but I did want to know more about what makes a statistically significant sample.
Yeah. So okay, here's what you should be looking for. So random sampling is what a lot of pollsters use. So almost everybody in Maryland or in the United States has access to a phone. So they have an equal probability of being entered into the sample. So when I purchase phone numbers for Maryland, now because Maryland has a high percentage of what we call CPOs or cell phone onlys, purchase about 80%-ish of our sample from cell phones and about another 20% from landlines. And because that gives us a full coverage across the state and everybody has an equal probability of being selected into the sample. And then from there, it's just basic sampling methodology. I want to be able to tell you plus or minus, like I want to be able to tell you what an individual result is plus or minus like around 4% is usually my goal, right? And that means that so I take a random sample using a 95% confidence interval. I can tell you that from 800 completed interviews, 800 randomly sampled Marylanders, I can tell you within plus or minus 3.5% of any given response. So if you are Larry Hogan and your approval rating is 50%, you know, with a margin of error plus or minus 3, it is going to be as high as 53 or it's going to be as low as 47, somewhere in that range. So we're thinking about so look for a reputable public opinion poll is going to have anywhere from like around 600 to 800 completed interviews. Is their base sample. The margin of error then for those subsamples will be higher. So the reason you want to, the more completed interviews you have, the better, because then you can slice and dice and those individual subsets will have, you know, you can decrease the margin of error for those individual subsets. So the margin of error associated with like 800 completed interviews or 600 completed interviews is really negligible. There's only one, 1 point something % difference between those two. The difference is when you have 800 completed interviews, you're better able to look at the subsamples, because margin of error, the way the margin of error, it takes up really, really quickly and then it levels off. So as you're getting, it doesn't keep on getting exponentially better. It eventually levels off. So you should be looking for, you're looking for 600 to 800 completed interviews. The times I've released polls with lower than 600 completed interviews, like for example, sometimes when I'll screen out a subsample of Maryland likely voters and I'll have like, 350 or 400, I won't release crosstabs with it then. Like I'll just give you the top line and say, here's the top line result, plus or minus 5%. That's the result. But I'm not gonna cut it down any further for you, because the margin of error associated with those subsamples are so high that you wouldn't be able to distinguish the results from each other.
Okay, that makes sense.
Thing too, by the way, if somebody has a survey of 400 completed interviews, buyer beware with what the crosstabs say, because you're really starting to get into high margin of error territory. It's just about, you just gotta be really careful when you interpret it. And that's another big thing when you're looking at the subsamples. Just be aware of it. Like, so we're going to release on Monday and Tuesday of next week, and one of our subsamples, I decided to break out by major county for our release, because we have 1,000 completed interviews. I paid to get more interviews this time so I could look at the policing questions by these major counties. I thought was really important.
Mm-hmm.
But so you'll be able to do some comparisons with Baltimore City versus everybody else. But I mean, my warning is like, it's only going to be 110 completed interviews from Baltimore City, which is enough, I think, to be able to compare, to get a little first cut picture. But nobody should be doing slicing and dicing any down any further than that. So I think, and that's an important thing just to keep in mind.
Oh, that is really helpful. So thank you for that. We have a question from the chat. Actually, Karen Denny may want to ask a follow-up on this, but she's asking, how important are the trends in polling leading up to an election? So how likely are those trends, are they like firm marchers towards election day, or can things change radically?
I wouldn't say radically, but I would say that the 2016 presidential election was determined by the margins. So it doesn't need radical change to change the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing with it's amazing in a lot of ways, right? Because the national vote doesn't matter at all, So right. It's weird. You think about like the population of California and how like there's no campaigning there, and it's going to be all but decided very quickly on election day. So Maryland as well. But yes, I would say that that even slight changes in a polling average going into election day can cause really big changes in the outcome. And so that's, if you look back in 2016, it's not, I mean, Hillary Clinton won by millions of votes, but it's the tens of thousands of votes in key areas, which polls did indicate that the gap was narrowing, that gave the victory to Donald Trump. So always look at that as horse race and always think about it in terms of margin of error. You should always be tracking it out for yourself. Like once you start to cross into the margin of error, it's anybody's game. And that's what, for Donald Trump, everything broke his way on election day back in 2016.
And so kind of
very easily went the other way for Clinton, but it didn't.
Right. And so going back to something you said earlier, it's almost like, when you're sewing a pattern or whatnot, and there's, every little piece is just incrementally off. It's not such a big deal if one piece, but it's like all those slight errors or things that you're not tracking at that grassroots level, like what the Goucher poll does, just get magnified when you aggregate it. Is that kind of how I should think about it?
Listen, I love a good polling average. I think it's because I think individual shops can have our. I think everybody there's anytime you're drawing a random sample, there's always a chance that your sample is off completely. So I think it's great to have great to look at the aggregate. But what I'm saying is, like, It's also important to identify, like if you start to see a trend happening, sometimes an outlier, what seems like an outlier, is actually the beginning of a new trend. And so it's really difficult to completely discern. And unfortunately, only some states get a lot of polling. So they're, we'll release our poll, and I don't even know if another telephone survey will come out in Maryland before the election. But you will see in all these other sort of statewide the important statewide races, you're going to see a lot of people polling them. It's important, I think, to identify the high quality pollsters, look at their trends to sort of, I think, get a really good view of what's happening. Now, different election aggregators have different standards for who they include in their model. Some folks decide that they put basically anybody in. So anybody who releases a poll gets kind of aggregated in there. And other election aggregators or poll aggregators are a little bit more selective on who they actually start to put into their average. But I think it's important not just to look at a rolling average, but to look at sort of the current state of the race, because polls are snapshots in time. Look at the current state, and then you can sort of decide where the trends are going from there.
Terrific. Thank you. So I'm noticing that it's 10:13. So are there any other questions? We could probably take one more if someone has a burning question.
I want to say bye, William. Bye, William Ford, who I get to see sometimes, I get to talk to frequently.
Yes. No, I feel like it's old home week. You get to see all the people you talk to.
I know. I'm very excited.
Great. Well, then I will thank you, Mileah, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. It was invaluable. And now I just want to give a little plug for the next session in our Need to Know Election series. 2 weeks from now, Susan Canfora of the Coastal Point is going to be talking to us about how to interview people on sensitive subjects, which elections really tend to be right now. And then I also wanted to plug MDDC's internship program. We offer summer internships to college students, embedding in member newsrooms, and the application is open for that now. And I encourage everyone to take a look at that and find out more information on our website at mddcpress.com. So thank you all once again. I will post this recording in the Friday Planner and on our YouTube channel. And once again, thank you so much, Mileah, for helping us with this.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. Let me know if I can do anything for you.
Will do. Thank you.